Hello everyone and welcome, those of you who are here with us in person and those of you joining us online this evening. My name is Eve Patton and I'm Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is Trinity's research institute for the arts and humanities. And some of you may know that the Hub also hosts the Schuler Democracy Forum, which is supported by Dr. Beata Schuler. And the forum is working under the coordinator, Dr. Ellie Payne, and our media fellow, Mark Little, on the theme of democracy and the media. So the forum is running this discussion this evening in collaboration with Boston College. So with that said, what are we gathering to discuss? If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Well, those are the words from the broadcaster, author, and libertarian George Orwell, and they were inscribed beside his statue on the wall of BBC's Broadcasting House in London in 2017. 5 years later, in 2022, we're marking the centenary of the founding of the BBC and questioning the extent to which that institution and its Irish counterpart, RTE, have been able to maintain Orwell's commitment to the freedom of speaking and hearing, specifically in relation to the traumatic events and scenes of the Northern Ireland Troubles. Now, these questions will necessarily address the legislative power of politicians, the authority of policing forces, the interventions of propagandists and paramilitaries, and crucially, of course, the autonomy of journalists, editors, filmmakers, and photographers. And they also have to address a complex history which incorporates not only the broadcasting ban that operated, of course, in both jurisdictions, but also on an itinerary of landmark documentaries from Panorama's Britain's Wasteland to Thames Television's Death on the Rock, creative works such as Clark and Doyle's Elephant, and the day-to-day work of reporting decisions that informed what we saw, what we heard of events from the hunger strikes to the Brighton bomb, to the Milltown Cemetery shootings, to the Enniskillen Poppy Day explosion, and more. These are inevitably very difficult questions, but of renewed pertinence, I think, in the middle of another very different broadcasting landscape following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the media war, which has become very much part of that conflict. Well, fortunately, we have an expert panel here today to guide some of these reflections, and I want to introduce them to you now and welcome them in the order that they're going to be speaking this evening. I want to welcome first Robert Savage, Professor of the Practice of History at Boston College and a former Trinity Long Room Hub visiting research fellow, so I'm welcoming him back to the building. Rob has published several books and articles exploring Irish and British history, particularly in terms of media representation, including A Loss of Innocence, Television and Irish Society from 2010, the BBC's Irish Troubles from 2015, and just recently, in this year, Northern Ireland, the BBC and censorship in Thatcher's Britain. Our second speaker is Alva O'Neill, who is Usher Professor in Law here at Trinity and a Senior Counsel at the Bar of Ireland. Alva lectures in corporate governance and media law here at Trinity. As a practicing barrister, she's advised on a wide range of legislation connected with the Irish banking crisis. She's also an expert on media law and is co-author of the Essential Media Law in Ireland from 2011. Third, we have Roger Bolton, British television producer, television and radio presenter, whose voice I know will be familiar to many of you. Across his career, Roger has presented Feedback and Sunday for BBC Radio 4. He has edited Panorama and Nationwide for the BBC and This Week for Thames Television, and it was for the latter that he led the BAFTA award-winning team that made Death on the Rock. He has also served as head of the BBC's Network Production Centre and controller of factual programmes at Thames Television and worked as an independent producer. And he's a fellow of the Royal Television Society. And Roger, you're very welcome. And our fourth speaker also will be a familiar voice and presence and face to many people in this room. Tommy Gorman, Irish journalist and former RTE Northern editor. Tommy has worked as a journalist since 1977, and he retired as RTE's Northern editor in April 2001 after 21 years based in Belfast. He also served as RTE's Brussels-based Europe editor from 1989 to 2001, and he was named Ireland's European of the Year in 2001. And Tommy's also recently published an acclaimed memoir, Never Better, on which we congratulate him. So those are our speakers, and all of them will have roughly 10 minutes, slightly more, I think, in your case, Rob, as you're starting off. And then we hope to have time for discussion and for questions from you in the audience. And if you're joining us online, please do put your questions into the Q&A panel, and we'll hope to get to as many of those as we can before we finish at 7:30. So with that done, I will open the topic of censorship, media and conflict, the case of Northern Ireland, and hand over to Rob Savage.
Thanks. Thanks, Eve. It's great to be back here at the Long Room Hub. I'd also like to thank Ellie Payne and Rob and Katrina and all the staff here at the Hub. It's just a great place to come back to. So as the historian, I'd like to basically provide a little bit of context to the issue of censorship and the Northern Ireland conflict by addressing its origins in both the Republic as well as in Northern Ireland. A critical point to make at the outset is that different forms of censorship existed long before the outbreak of the Troubles. An Irish radio service began broadcasting in 1926, and until the passage of the 1960 Broadcasting Act, that service functioned as part of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs. The civil servants that operated Radio Éireann were answerable to their minister and practiced a remarkable type of self-censorship that kept any sort of controversy off the air. The Broadcasting Act that accompanied the arrival of television in 1960 changed this dynamic. It provided journalists with the freedom to challenge political and religious authorities, much to the chagrin of elites who had long avoided the scrutiny of the broadcast media. In the case of Northern Ireland, the BBC also practiced a form of self-censorship, constantly deferring to the unionist establishment in Belfast. Even with the arrival of television in 1953, until the late 1960s, unionists enjoyed significant influence over what was and what was not broadcast in and about the region. Another point to emphasize is that until the violence erupted in August of 1969, neither the BBC or RTE paid much attention to Northern Ireland, a dysfunctional statelet characterized by widespread discrimination in voting, housing, and employment. The region was simply ignored by broadcasters both in London as well as Dublin. In the Republic, after the outbreak of violence, RTE scrambled to fill the void and address the region's descent into chaos. Much of the work was innovative and successful in addressing the systemic social, economic, and political problems that had long plagued the region. As violence intensified in the early 1970s, Jack Lynch's Fine Gael government became increasingly concerned that RTE's reporting would exacerbate violence and cause it to spread south of the border. His government was particularly alarmed by airtime given to members of Sinn Féin in both the official and provisional wings of the IRA. RTE was warned that unless it stopped giving subversives access to radio and television, unspecified steps would be taken to rein in the national broadcaster. In June of 1971, Mike Burns, host of This Week, contacted the Minister of Justice, inviting him onto a program that featured representatives of both the official and provisional IRA. The minister quickly declined, and when Jack Lynch was told of the program, he wrote to the RTE authority, declaring that the broadcast was, quote, contrary to the national interest, maintaining that, quote, subversive elements should not be given RTE facilities as a platform for their publicity. Nevertheless, the Director General went ahead with the program, annoying Jack Lynch and his colleagues in government. Later that year, the minister responsible for overseeing RTE, Jerry Collins, learned of a program being planned that would feature interviews with Sean McStephen and Cathal Goulding, two leading members of the IRA. Collins urged the chairman of the authority to cancel the program, but his intervention was ignored. This prompted the minister to issue a written directive under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act in October of 1971. The directive ordered the station to, quote, refrain from broadcasting any matter that could be calculated to promote the aims and activities of any organization which engages in, promotes, encourages, or advocates the attainment of any particular objective by violent means. In spite of the directive, coverage of the unrest continued to cause controversy as violence increased in 1972, provoking bitter complaints from leaders of all the political parties here in Dublin. The matter finally came to a head on Sunday, November 19th of 1972. A lunchtime radio program included a summary of an interview of IRA Chief of Staff Sean McStephen, who was quoted by correspondent Kevin O'Kelly as defending what the IRA leader referred to as the armed struggle, stating that in spite of a lull in bombing, we can, quote, escalate at will. McStephen discussed the killing of Protestants while offering assurances that their rights would be protected in a united Ireland, noting, quote, any Protestants that have been killed by the IRA have been killed because they have been serving in one or other of the British occupation forces. The government reacted to the broadcast swiftly, informing the authority that the program was, quote, in contravention to the direction issued to Radio Television Éireann under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. When the government met to consider its options, Collins told his colleagues that the authority had failed to abide by his October 1971 directive. Quote, for a long time, RTE has been broadcasting programs tending to encourage subversive elements in the community. The government supported Collins and immediately sacked the RTE authority. Jack Lynch, the Taoiseach, had absolutely no reservations about the decision to dismiss the public authority responsible for broadcasting in the state. On being told by reporters that many would conclude that the decision reflected poorly on his commitment to freedom of speech, the Taoiseach angrily replied, fuck them. Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act was later amended when Conor Cruise O'Brien was Minister for Posts and Telegraphs in a coalition Fine Gael Labour government. The strict regime of political censorship put in place was extraordinary, but underscored Dublin's desire to keep the IRA and its supporters off the airwaves. In Northern Ireland, or the United Kingdom, from the early days of radio in the 1920s through the 1960s, the BBC in both Belfast and London embraced self-censorship when issues, subjects, or news concerning Northern Ireland was at stake. This meant that the region's programming or programming from London about the region avoided any mention of discrimination, gerrymandering, or the grievances of the Catholic community. Programming that focused on Gaelic culture or suggested that Northern Ireland was in any way Irish provoked protest from unionists who argued that their Britishness was being undermined. These programs were therefore avoided. This changed in the early 1970s. As violence escalated, the British broadcast media, increasingly less deferential to Belfast and London, developed cutting-edge news and current affairs programming that questioned and criticized the police and authorities. Such criticism infuriated Westminster's Labour and Conservative governments alike, and especially angered unionists, the army, police, and civil servants in the Northern Ireland office. Determined to promote a narrative justifying their policies, British governments bullied the broadcast media, threatening to punish broadcasters for programming it defined as objectionable. Labour's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Roy Mason, famously denounced the BBC for glamorizing the IRA, defining its coverage of the conflict as appalling. He threatened to cut funding and impose outright censorship if the BBC did not behave in what he defined as a more responsible manner. When the Tories came to power in 1979, broadcasters were warned that the draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act would be deployed to prosecute correspondents in contact with members of the IRA. Such constant pressure by Labour and Conservative governments produced a degree of self-censorship within the broadcast media. Managers and editors were acutely aware that the arrest and prosecution of journalists and the imposition of formal censorship was not an idle threat, but a real possibility. In these circumstances, one might ask, why did the Thatcher government wait until 1988 to clamp down on the broadcast media? The decision to introduce censorship came after a particularly horrific series of events that saw the Army, the IRA, and loyalists engage in a series of sensational killings. In March of 1988, the Army shot and killed 3 unarmed IRA members in Gibraltar. This was followed by more violence in Belfast, first at Milltown Cemetery, where a loyalist gunman shot and killed 3 mourners attending the IRA funeral of those killed at Gibraltar, and then in Andersonstown, where 2 Army corporals were killed by the IRA. Television reporting from Belfast captured images of this violence, which was broadcast to regional, national, and international audiences. The killings in Gibraltar were the subject of a remarkable, award-winning documentary, Death on the Rock, produced by Roger Bolton for Thames Television. The broadcast infuriated Margaret Thatcher and many of her allies in the Conservative Party. A short time after the Gibraltar-related carnage, the IRA set off a bomb aboard a minibus in Lisburn, killing 6 soldiers who had taken part in a charity run to raise money for a local YMCA. Then in August, the IRA exploded a massive roadside bomb in Tyrone, killing 8 young soldiers, 6 of whom were still in their teens, and seriously wounding 28. The soldiers were aboard a bus returning from leave in Britain when the blast occurred, as they traveled late at night on a dark rural road in Tyrone. News coverage of the horrific bombing was extensive. Howard Thornton, the duty inspector of the Omagh RUC station, described the scene he encountered when he arrived with the young constable to help. Quote, "My whole memory of the scene was absolute carnage. It was like driving into hell." Although 8 were killed that day, the Irish News later reported that 5 young soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome later took their own lives. Reacting to the upsurge in violence, the Thatcher government announced a new security initiative, and the broadcast media, long in the sight of her government, became an easy target. Before the Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, announced the introduction of the broadcasting ban in Parliament, Marmaduke Hussey, who had been appointed chairman of the BBC's Board of Governors by the Thatcher government, was summoned to the Home Office. When told of the government's plan, Hussey noted that many in the BBC would be unhappy. However, he was resigned to the decision, telling Hurd, quote, privately, he could see some attraction in proceeding this way, not least in that the broadcasters had now been given a clear statement by the government about what could and could not be done. He welcomed the fact that the direction would not ban the actual reporting of events from Northern Ireland. Hussey and the Director General, Michael Checkland, issued a joint statement the day after Hurd's announcement, protesting the government's restrictions, arguing, quote, it sets a damaging precedent and will make our reporting of Northern Ireland affairs incomplete. The statement was cautious. It lacked any real sense of urgency. It did not use the word censorship or mention freedom of the press or free speech. When senior managers and editors met with the Deputy Director General, John Burt, a short time later, they expressed their anger at the imposition of censorship and were especially upset with the tepid reaction of senior executives. Senior staff complained bitterly that Hussey and Checkland were too quick to accept restrictions that would inhibit their work and too willing to engage in discussions concerning how the BBC would comply with the order. Many were angry that the Director General had not resolutely stood up to the Thatcher government and defended the difficult work the corporation had done during 20 years of appalling violence. They were convinced the BBC had been cowed and had behaved with timidity and inexcusable weakness. Over a 6-year period, Editors tried to work around the restrictions, sometimes by hiring actors to lip-sync the words of Sinn Féin politicians, only serving to highlight the absurdity of the ban. While this may have created bizarre political theater, it should be emphasized that the ban succeeded in silencing Republican voices. In the 4 years after the ban was put in place, Sinn Féin's appearance on British news programs dropped by 63%. Whatever one thinks of the politics of Sinn Féin, the party enjoyed considerable electoral support in spite of its embrace of the IRA's ruthless campaign of murder and mayhem. Formal censorship of the British broadcast media lasted until 1994, when John Major accepted that the policy was an impediment to the peace process that was unfolding. Journalists covering Northern Ireland for both RTE and the BBC and the independent television companies struggled with censorship, but still managed to produce compelling programming that addressed the conflict. In spite of the introduction of state censorship, a number of intrepid editors and journalists, two of whom are with us this evening, worked to explain the complexities and the brutality of Northern Ireland's troubles. They did this to audiences that were not only in Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic and in Great Britain, but around the world. At this point, you'll not hear from the historian. I'd like to turn things over to a legal scholar with considerable expertise on the subject of censorship, Dr. Alva O'Neill.
Thank you very much. Good evening. It's lovely to be here in the Long Room Hub. It's been a while since I've been standing here, so it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I've been asked to give a little bit of background and context, some of the legal issues that arose from the broadcasting ban, and that's what I'm going to do this evening. What I'm going to look at is the legal basis for the ban, how the courts treated it, what did the Irish courts do when the ban was brought before them, in a number of challenges to it that were brought by a range of different individuals. One challenge also went to the European Court of Human Rights. And then what happened to the ban afterwards? So where is it now? When was it repealed? And then finally, just some reflections on the changing legal landscape and how those cases might be decided differently today if the ban was still in force. I'm conscious that we have some visitors joining us from the United States, and I thought it would be helpful maybe to just introduce the Irish free speech guarantee in the Constitution. It's kind of wordy compared to the First Amendment. It's much more nuanced. So you have the right of the citizens to express freely their convictions and opinions, and then quite a big rider on that in terms of the qualifications. So compared with the First Amendment, it's a much more, some would say balanced, some might say restricted view of freedom of expression, for better or for worse. But there were some aspects of the wording that are just worth drawing attention to, because they arise when we look at the wording of the Section 31 provision. And that is that the state shall endeavour to ensure that organs of public opinion, such as the radio, the press, the cinema, while preserving their rightful liberty of expression, including criticism of government policy, shall not be used to undermine public authority or morality or the authority of the state. And that particular clause, undermining the authority of the state, makes an appearance when we look at the provisions in the Broadcasting Act that were introduced in 1960. And Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act 1960, as amended later in 1976, gave the then Minister for Communications the power to prohibit broadcasting in certain circumstances, and they're set out on this slide there. So it's where he's of the opinion that the broadcasting of a particular matter or any matter of a particular class would be likely to promote or incite to crime or would tend to undermine the authority of the state. He can then, by order, direct the authority, being the broadcasting authority, to refrain from broadcasting the matters or any matter of the particular class, and the authority shall comply with the order. So that wording, the authority of the state, comes from the Constitution itself. Interestingly, the original ban in Section 31 in 1960, before this amendment in 1976, was much broader and gave the minister almost carte blanche to direct that matters not be broadcast. So the 1976 amendment was intended to buttress the constitutionality of the provision by directly referring to this class of matter that would undermine the authority of the state. There was some parliamentary scrutiny built into this power of the minister. It's quite a significant power to allow a minister to direct that classes of material not be broadcast. So there was a provision in Section 31 that required any orders of the minister to be laid before the Oireachtas, and the Oireachtas had the power to annul the orders. So there was some level of parliamentary scrutiny. And I'm not a legal historian, and I haven't gone back and looked at the Dáil debates, but from recollection, I don't believe that parliamentary scrutiny was very exacting. So I think in reality, these orders were passed with relatively little controversy by majority. The orders could only remain in force for 12 months, but they could be extended for a further 12 months, and a further 12 months, and a further 12 months, almost ad infinitum. And that is, in fact, what happened. So what was the ban in Ireland? The ban in Ireland was very broad. So it prohibited broadcasting of interviews or reports of interviews with anyone from Sinn Féin and a number of other prescribed organisations. It also prohibited the broadcast of spokesmen for those organisations, and also any broadcast that would be advocating or inviting support for the organisation. So it was an extremely broad ban. And it was used in a number of different ways. So, for example, it was used to prohibit the making of election broadcasts on behalf of Sinn Féin. It was also used most famously, and has already been referenced this evening, to prohibit the live broadcasting of voices of Sinn Féin representatives. I thought it was really interesting to hear the first speaker refer to self-censorship, because that's something that arises in the legal challenges as well, and in fact was one of the subjects of one of the legal challenges that I'll come to in a moment. So RTE interpreted the ban very strictly and self-censored its political coverage. And as the first speaker already mentioned, the UK also had a ban and got around it by dubbing the voices. So there were a number of challenges that were brought throughout the life of the ban. And the first one was the state lynch against Cooney in 1982. And this was brought by a Sinn Féin candidate in the run-up to a general election. And he wanted to issue a party political broadcast on radio and television. And RTE had agreed that they were going to broadcast this. And then the minister brought in the order prohibiting this. And in the High Court, it was held that the minister's decision to make this order was not reviewable, that it wasn't something that a court could second guess. And that meant that there was an inadequate balance of the interests of free speech and the authority of the state. So the High Court decision is quite a pro-free speech decision, particularly judged in the context of the time. So in 1982, Irish free speech law wasn't really very well developed, to put it mildly. It's changed a lot since. So this case, I think, really is one of the early examples of the High Court emphasising the free speech guarantee in the Constitution. And what they said was that by making this order and by it being not reviewable by the courts, it gave the minister too much discretion to interfere with freedom of expression. It was overturned on appeal in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, actually, that's a misreading of the provision. And in fact, the court does retain the power to review the minister's exercise of discretion. However, having found that, which seems like, I suppose, a win, they then went on to say that actually, having reviewed it, we don't think he's gone too far in the exercise of his powers. And they pointed out that the minister had cogent grounds for believing that Sinn Féin aimed at undermining the authority of the state, so that any broadcast which sought support for such an organisation could properly be regarded by the minister as being likely to promote or incite to crime or tend to undermine the state's authority. So we have two decisions there, two early decisions on the ban in the Lynch case. The next case wasn't a case that was brought in an Irish court. It was a complaint that was made to the then European Commission on Human Rights. So the European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg administers the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10 of which protects free speech. Like the Irish protection, it's actually quite nuanced and quite balanced. And it used to have a sort of a filter stage where you made a complaint to the Commission on Human Rights, and then it would then decide whether or not your complaint was well enough grounded to go to the court. And that's what happened in this case. And this Betty Purcell was a journalist, and there were a number of journalists, television presenters, and two trade unions that backed this complaint about the Irish law to the European Commission on Human Rights. And what's interesting about this is that they didn't just challenge the Section 31 order or the legislation underpinning it. They also challenged in their complaint the RTE guidelines that had been issued by the broadcaster themselves. And they said the guidelines were in fact restricting freedom of expression and restricting them in the exercise of their own freedom of expression as media, members of the media. And they said that the guidelines gravely distorted coverage of all news events, current affairs and social developments in Northern Ireland, and that they were deterring journalists and producers from choosing to put on programmes relating to any issue in Northern Ireland and preventing them from complying with the requirement as to balance and impartiality in the programmes they produced. And they said, there's already a provision in the then 1960 Act that would be sufficient to cover the most extreme examples of things that might legitimately be curtailed. And for that reason, they said that these guidelines and the ban itself were not required. One of the things that was raised by the government in opposition, standing over the Irish legal position, was that in fact these individual journalists and trade unions weren't entitled to make the complaint, and that was dismissed by the Commission, saying no, they're all entitled to come in and make this complaint because they're exercising their free speech rights, and that those rights are being directly affected by the terms of the order, and in fact they face disciplinary action if they were to breach the RTE guidelines as part of their contract of employment. The Commission also accepted one of the complaints then that was raised by the Irish government was, well, they should have gone to court. You're not supposed to go to Strasbourg until you've exhausted your domestic remedies. And again, that was rejected. And they said, no, it's quite clear from the State Lynch and Cooney that they would have had no chance of winning the case because the Supreme Court had made the legal position clear in Lynch. So they then went on to say, we're going to have a look at this now and we're going to look at it under Article 10. And they said there's certainly a restriction with free speech. It's prescribed by law because you can see what the ban is. It has a legitimate aim, and here they were really heavily swayed by the Supreme Court's decision in Lynch, which had emphasised national security as a justification for the ban. And in effect, they said that they weren't really willing to look behind the Irish government's assessment of that risk. And they said there was no restriction on the content of TV and radio programmes, and they accepted the submission that was made by Ireland that the purpose of this ban was to ensure that spokesmen didn't use the opportunity of a live interview or other broadcast to promote illegal activities. And they said it was to deny representatives of known terrorist organisations and their political supporters the possibility of using the broadcast media as a platform for advocating their cause, encouraging support for their organisations, and conveying the impression of their legitimacy, which I think has been a really important aspect of the ban. They went on to point out the importance of the broadcast media, the immediacy of the impact of the broadcast media, which they said might justify a ban that wouldn't be acceptable, for example, in the print media. And they said that live statements also have a special risk of coded messages being conveyed, a risk which even conscientious journalists cannot control within the exercise of their professional judgment. And again, all of this was taken from submissions that had been made on behalf of the Irish government defending the ban. So the Commission ultimately held that the complaint was manifestly ill-founded and therefore didn't meet the threshold to go to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights never had the opportunity of judging the ban as against Article 10. The next challenge then was made in an Irish court, and it was the O'Toole and RTE case in the early 1990s. And staff at RTE had been directed by their employer that interviews with members of a number of organisations, including Sinn Féin, were banned, regardless of the topic of the interview. And what happened in this case was the applicant was a member of Sinn Féin, which was one of the groups subject to the ban. He also happened to be the spokesman for a strike committee, which was involved in industrial dispute. So RTE, who were covering this industrial dispute, conducted some interviews with him, presumably before realising who he was, and then refused to broadcast them. And they said, you can't broadcast these interviews because you're a member of Sinn Féin and those interviews aren't covered by the ban. And he took a challenge to the RTE direction and said, look, this was about something else, and the fact that I'm a member of Sinn Féin should be neither here nor there. RTE defended the blanket ban that they had in their guidelines, and they said, look, this is the only practical way to make sure that we're complying with the minister's order. And said there was also the danger that an interviewee could use the opportunity to suddenly start advocating on behalf of Sinn Féin or touching on matters that were within the spirit of the ban. And the court rejected both of those arguments, saying that the issue of consistency could be addressed by monitoring broadcasts and that the second concern could be addressed by insisting on pre-recorded interviews instead of live ones. So they weren't very swayed by those arguments. In the Supreme Court, when it was appealed, the court said that the RTE direction was an amendment of the terms of the ministerial order. So he said that actually what RTE had done here was they had gone further than was required by the ministerial order and had effectively implemented a blanket ban without any context. And they said that actually if you looked at these broadcasts that have been banned, they would never have fallen within the minister's order. So in effect, the media was over-enthusiastically censoring itself. And finally, just one more challenge that arose, again, the same year. And this, I think, really illustrates the extent to which the ban captured all manner of communications that were possibly not intended. And this was a radio ad from a publisher who published a book of short stories written by Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin. And what was at issue here was the script of a proposed ad for this book of short stories. And it was sent to RTE for clearance. And it read as follows. This is Gerry Adams speaking. My new book is called The Street and Other Stories. I'm not going to try and emulate Mr. Adams. And it's on sale in good bookshops in the 32 counties. Most of the stories are about ordinary people and everyday events, and there's a fair bit of crack in them too. That's The Street and Other Stories, and this is Gerry Adams. I think you might enjoy it. Sloan. Of course, the reference to the 32 counties there, which would be immediately apparent to the Irish audience, is a reference to the entire island of Ireland. The ad was rejected by RTE, and they said, we can't run this because the Section 31 of the Act, together with the ban under the order, precludes RTE from taking any comments from the author. The applicant then relied on O'Toole and said, look, the Supreme Court has already told RTE that they're completely expanding the scope of this ban. RTE, however, argued that this was different to O'Toole because unlike O'Toole, who just happened to be a member of Sinn Féin who was involved in an industrial dispute, they said Gerry Adams is the public face of the organisation to such a degree that to broadcast him on any subject, no matter how apparently innocuous, would actually amount to inviting support for Sinn Féin. And it would be a broadcast by a person representing Sinn Féin and would tend to undermine the authority of the state. What did the High Court do with the Brandon Books challenge? They said that this was a matter for RTE to judge using its expertise as the National Broadcasting Authority. And they said that such a judgment, once that discretion was being engaged, was not reviewable by the court. And they distinguished O'Toole and said in O'Toole there would be no exercise of discretion, there was simply a blanket ban. Whereas what this involved was the Broadcasting Authority looking at the context, looking at the subject matter, and exercising its judgment that it fell within the ban. What happened to the ban then? Where did it go? It was ultimately repealed in the Broadcasting Act 2001. The power to make these orders was repealed in the Broadcasting Act 2001. And the ministerial orders themselves lapsed in the mid-1990s against the background of the peace process in Northern Ireland, although it's somewhat extraordinary that up until 2001, in theory, it would have been possible for the minister to make such an order. And we now have a provision which was retained in our revision of the Broadcasting Act 2009, that broadcasters must ensure that anything which may reasonably be regarded as causing harm or offence, or of being likely to promote or incite to crime or tending to undermine the authority of the state is not broadcast by the broadcaster. But in the absence of the ministerial orders fleshing those out, I think the exercise is quite different. Number of reflections then on Section 31. Just to note in passing, as has already been mentioned, the UK also had a ban. The UK broadcasters, I think, interpreted their powers slightly differently and, for example, would dub voices in news and current affairs broadcasting. The approach of the European Commission on Human Rights left it to Ireland to assess the balance. So it showed that the Strasbourg route was not going to be of any avail to people seeking to challenge this, and they weren't willing to second guess what the Irish government was saying about the importance of the ban. Another thing to point out is that last case, the Brandon Books case, I think is really a bit of an outlier in terms of the approach that was taken in the High Court. So while it seems to finish on a slightly conservative note, I think it would be very, very different if that challenge was taken today, partly because the evolution of our understanding of judicial review has been so significant. In other words, what is reviewable is now much broader than might have been understood at the time. And secondly, there's a much stronger emphasis on free speech law. And in particular, for those of you who are watching from the United States, I would say that you might get the impression from looking at these cases that Irish free speech law is completely different to US free speech law and has very limited protections for freedom of expression. But in fact, more recent case law in other contexts has demonstrated that there's a relatively robust approach taken to free speech now, although that wouldn't have been the case when these bans were challenged. Thank you very much.
Oh, crikey. Right.
Sorry.
Do you mind if I sit? Oh, you want me to stand? Oh, right, okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
Wow. Right. Just before I really get going, I'd just like to say that I want to express my admiration for the journalists here and in Northern Ireland, certainly from 1974, in the way they covered the appallingly difficult questions raised by the Troubles. People like myself, based in the mainland, could fly in, fly out. The journalists working in the north had to go back to the communities in which they lived, upon which they were reporting, and where they were frequently reviled by trying as hard as they could, most of them, to report fairly and objectively. So anybody from the mainland like me should be very careful what they say. From 1974, within Northern Ireland, I believe the reporting was pretty good. The second thing I want to say before we really get started is that the underlying question here is the one that faces all democracies, which is how far should you go in order to protect the democracy, particularly against those people who wish to get rid of that democracy. Germany, as you will know, after the Second World War, faced with the fact that Hitler got to power democratically and was elected, tried to struggle with this question, came up with the ban on communists, for example, standing in elections, which would appear to us to be ridiculous, but in the context of a Germany which had seen its previous democracy destroyed by someone democratically elected, you could understand why they felt in the way they did. So the overwhelming issue for us all, and for you in the South, where the gun has been a part of political life in the 20th century and 21st century, that's the general question. The third thing I want to come to is why was the broadcasting ban introduced when everybody involved virtually knew it was stupid and would be ineffective? The minister who introduced it, the Secretary of State, Douglas Hurd, as is very clear from Robert's book, didn't believe in it. In fact, I was in the room when there was a conversation where he apologized to others for doing it. He said there are only 2 or 3 things in a political career you should stand up for, where you can really make a difference, particularly when you're dealing with Mrs. Thatcher, and this isn't one of them. So why did it happen? I think you've got to look at Mrs. Thatcher as the central figure. You start from the point of view that she knows little or nothing about Ireland at all. She's a very English person. Before she became Prime Minister, the only government job she had was Secretary of State for Education. When it came to Ireland in the run-up to 79 and her election, she thought that the man who had got her elected effectively as leader of the Conservative Party, Éireann Naoimh, broke out of Colditz, great war hero, he was going to solve it. What precisely Éireann Naoimh was going to do, who knows, but he would talk darkly about taking out certain leaders and things like that. Mrs. Thatcher, in other words, had total faith in Éireann Naoimh to deal with Ireland. The INLA blew him up 3 weeks before the election, a bomb that went off as his car went out of the car park at the House of Westminster. Mrs. Thatcher then, of course, was blown up herself in 1984 at Brighton. Friends of her killed. She survived surprisingly. She knew she was at the top of the IRA's list. She knew her children were targets. She was deeply worried about that. So this was intensely personal for her. By the way, her former private secretary, Ian Gow, was blown up but 2 years later in 1990. So she was ignorant about Ireland. She was personally very much affected by the threat and by murders. And the other thing is Mrs. Thatcher had a very visceral response also when it came to the soldiers she thought were defending our liberty. It was instructive during the Falklands campaign that whereas people like Willie Whitelaw and Francis Pym, who'd fought in the war, knew the moment the war, or actually it wasn't the Falklands war was never declared, once the conflict happened, they were waiting for casualties. So when the Sheffield was hit, I think around about 200 people killed total in the end, they were not surprised. They thought it was rather light. Mrs. Thatcher was shattered. She retreated for 24 hours, deeply upset, taking it intensely personally, insisting on writing to the the parents or families of everybody being killed. So you've got this person who understands nothing about Ireland, who has this visceral, as it were, response, but also is deeply frustrated that she thinks by 1988 she has solved a lot of the problems that existed. She dealt with the trade unions. She dealt with the Argentinians. The economy was improving. She'd won a third election in succession. But this Northern Ireland problem won't go away. So when these events happen, Secretary of State, I think you've got to understand the Secretary of States of Northern Ireland and the BBC in that way, there was a policy that operated with Northern Ireland, which was pretty much, I think, reporting everything fairly, Sinn Féin on the air, etc. And then there was what went to the mainland and what she might have seen. And the object was to stop her seeing things, if possible. The trouble is, when she saw them, she wanted action. And so the Northern Ireland office and the Home Office together would have a list of things ready to give her, because in the sense they could give her nothing which would affect the Troubles substantially. And she would think of a policy which would significantly, or wouldn't countenance a policy which would significantly affect the Troubles. So what can they do? They offer the broadcasting ban. They have no confidence it's going to work, but at least it stops her doing anything else. Because what you have consistently in the British government, and whether it be Labour or Conservative, is an unwillingness to face up to some of the realities in Northern Ireland. The third thing you've got, which I'm sad to say, is a belief in most British journalists that nobody really wants to know much about Ireland. The audiences won't be great. And I, as an editor both of Panorama and This Week, did not have many reporters banging on my door asking to go over there. So the ban gets introduced. To be fair to the BBC, I was not then, I'd left the BBC or had been defenestrated by that point in 1988. To be fair to the BBC, all of the senior journalists on the ground opposed the ban, and everybody did their best to get round it. Dubbing is one thing, making sure during elections, when you could report what was happening with Sinn Féin, they did so. But I think when you're making a judgment about who benefited from this, the honest truth is I don't know, but there is an argument to be made that Sinn Féin benefited. The statistics show that they appeared less, but they were able to continue the Armalite in one hand, or the bomb more frequently, and the ballot box in the other, and avoid any serious scrutiny, because you might dub a 2-minute interview and put a voice on, so you see Gerry Adams' face and you hear another voice. You can't do that for 25, 30 minutes. So all of those interviews disappeared. So all of the real scrutiny that could have been applied was not applied. That's why I think you can make a case that it benefited. And then in 1994, after the IRA had attempted to blow up John Major and failed, number 10 Downing Street, it became part of their negotiating practice, the thing that could be pushed, got rid of, in order to help the peace process. Of course, while all of this ban is going on, Mrs. Thatcher knows, but doesn't want to know in detail, that MI6 is having a relationship of some sort with Martin McGuinness, brackets Gerry Adams, to push them further and further along to this sort of peace process. So all of that is going on. I think, how could journalists have done a better job? I think most of them did a pretty good job, except for the indifference of the English. I hate to say this, but it's a consistent pattern. Look at what happened at Brexit. Until John Major and Tony Blair came over just before the vote and explained the complications it would create, potential disaster, there's virtually little attention. Didn't bother Boris Johnson a bit. Doesn't bother most people. There's been no history, proper history of Ireland for at least 40 years on British television. So you've always got to factor in, sadly, the indifference. My frustration as a programme editor is that we were too often summoned by violence, not actually there and doing the proper analytical programmes. I tried to do programmes and failed, looking at who the IRA were, what they thought, what sort of society were they trying to create, were they a socialist society, a Marxist society or not, what would they propose that could possibly persuade 1 million or more Protestants in the north to be part of a larger island. But all of those programs never got made. And because they got made, the people, in my view, who used military force, that applies to a number of people, had too dominant a role because we didn't create the space for more politics. The broadcasting ban made that, in my view, more difficult.
Good evening. It's lovely to be with you. I've come up from Sligo this evening, and listening to Roger there, I just said to myself, I'm sorry that there weren't people of his stature and instincts around during the Brexit debate, because I think we might be in a different place now. But I think as a result of that absence, we're in a new place, a new phase of the relationship between neighbouring islands. I'd say lots of you have heard of Charlie Flanagan. He's a TD for the Laois Offaly constituency. But he served in his time as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Justice. And in October 1976, he was looking forward to his 21st birthday. It was coming up on November the 1st. But on the 16th of October, at a place called Garryhinch on the Laois Offaly border, something significant and unexpected happened. Charlie's father, Oliver Jay, was a TD for the area. He was also a junior minister in the government. In those days, junior ministers were called parliamentary secretaries. And Oliver J. Flanagan was parliamentary secretary to the Minister for Defence. At the time, the 1976 Emergency Powers Act, the government was attempting to introduce legislation to stiffen the rights of the Gardaí to stop and search and detain those it believed might be involved in paramilitary activities. And on the night of October the 16th, Gardaí in Portlaoise received an anonymous phone call suggesting armed men had gathered at a derelict farmhouse in Garryhinch with the intention of kidnapping the local TD, Oliver J. Flanagan. 5 Gardaí went to the deserted farmhouse. 24-year-old Michael Clerkin got into the building through an open window at the back. When he went to open the front door for his colleagues to let them in, a booby-trap bomb exploded. The explosives were in a gas cylinder dug into the ground under the floorboards at the doorway. Michael Clerkin was killed. The others were injured. One of them, a detective called Tom Peters, was blinded and deafened. A spokesperson for Provisional Sinn Féin was interviewed on RTE denying the IRA were involved in the incident. And in response, the then Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, Conor Cruise O'Brien, issued a directive strengthening Section 31 of the 1960 Broadcasting Act. It banned spokespersons of specific organisations from the airwaves entirely. Incidentally, it was 41 years before the Garda who lost his life in that explosion, Michael Clerkin, was posthumously awarded the Scott Medal for bravery. Part of the reason for the delay was it was said he had not shown outstanding bravery. He was simply doing his job, gaining entry to a building by a back window. The 4 other Guard officers who were also there on that night, they too received Scott Gold Medals. The presentation was made by the then Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan. I met him several times in his role both as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Justice. He had an important role in keeping the dialogue going between British and Irish governments, between Dublin and Belfast, and between the parties in Northern Ireland at a time when Stormont was closed because of the collapse of power sharing around the cash for ash controversy. like most and probably all Southern politicians, he is an advocate of power sharing in Northern Ireland, with Sinn Féin centrally involved. He has never made the case for a coalition in Dáil Éireann that would involve his party, Fine Gael, with Sinn Féin. Next up, I want to give you a sense of what it was like to work as a journalist during the Troubles, when Section 31 was operating. I had just turned 25 in Easter 1981, when I had my first exposure to rioting in Derry. I'm from Sligo, south of the border, 30 miles from Black Lion and Belcoo. That Easter weekend, 2 teenagers had been knocked down and killed by a British Army vehicle, and there was mayhem on the streets. Masked gangs were making huge barricades in the Brandywell and the Bogside. They were hijacking cars and setting them on fire. I remember going with a cameraman, Johnny Coughlin, and sound recordist Norman Dungan. They were from our Belfast office. They were veterans of the Troubles. And we filmed gang members filling bottles with petrol and attaching pieces of cloth that would be used as fuses and set alight. The petrol bombs were for throwing at the British Army. At one of the barricades, I asked some of those involved, "Why are you doing this?" The interviews were not used because I had failed to ask them, were they involved in the IRA? When I think about it now, fortunately, those images weren't shown, because had they been, they probably would have been arrested. They would have been put in jail, and if ever they wanted to go to the United States, for instance, these teenagers would have had that black mark against them for the rest of their lives. They would have been stopped traveling. Your dilemma as a reporter, your challenge, your job is to know what's going on. And in those days working in the Troubles, you would meet people who you knew were associated with the IRA. There would be a code word. Let's say it was Christmas tree. After a killing or a bombing or a shooting took place, the call would come to a newsroom, to a specific journalist saying, Christmas tree. And that was the way that it was confirmed that an organization had carried out a shooting or a killing. And that was a reality of your work. That was something that occurred day in, day out during the Troubles involving journalists. I worked for the RTE News Division as Northwestern correspondent, covering the likes of Derry, Donegal, Cavan, Monaghan, Sligo and Leitrim. The Belfast office was the place constantly under pressure. It was staffed by magnificent journalists. Such was the demanding nature of the work that you had to be good and you had to be tough to survive. News was about the basics of journalism, the who, what, where, when, why questions, getting the important details, make sure you have an accurate account of them and get them on air. Incidents were happening all the time. A killing, condemnation, a funeral, retaliation. In those days, RTE's Current Affairs Department did most of the analysis. It was based in Dublin. In Current Affairs, there were ongoing internal debates about the validity of Section 31. A group of producers and reporters supported it. When the hunger strike campaign was building and Margaret Thatcher's government was under pressure to bend, some argued that this was a propaganda campaign by Republicans and RTE should be very wary of it. As a result, RTE's Current Affairs Department provided very limited coverage about what was happening before the death of Bobby Sands in May 1981. Bobby Sands being elected to the Westminster Parliament in the 1981 Fermanagh South Tyrone by-election was a major victory for the Republican movement. And when you think about it now, the element of coincidence and circumstances coming together at different times in history that can be so significant. The serving MP in that constituency, Frank Maguire, died. It caused a by-election. There was huge emotion around the hunger strikes. Bobby Sands was put forward as a candidate. He actually won the election. After his death, there was a by-election. This time his election agent, Owen Carron, stood, and in August 1981, he retained that seat. In the June Dáil elections, 9 prisoners were put forward as candidates. Kieran Doherty won a seat in Cavan Monaghan, and Paddy Agnew won a seat in Louth. On Phoblacht, in a 2006 piece about those elections, noted how RTE's enthusiastic implementation of Section 31, political censorship legislation, that prevented Republicans being interviewed in the broadcast area. It was also in 1981 that Danny Morrison spoke at a Sinn Féin Ordesh, saying, "Who here really believes we can win the war through the ballot box? But will anyone here object if, with a ballot box in this hand and an Armalite in the other, we take power in Ireland?" This was the origin of what became known as the ballot box and the Armalite strategy. In 1982, 5 Sinn Féin members were elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, Owen Carron, Danny Morrison and Jim McAllister. It failed as an institution. The SDLP returned 14 representatives but said they would not take their seats. In June 1983, Alex Maskey was elected to Belfast City Council and became the first Sinn Féin member elected to that authority since the 1920s. In 1983 too, Gerry Adams was elected as MP for West Belfast. The Alex Maskey I referred to there, the first Sinn Féin councillor elected in Belfast, is the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the man who met Prince Charles, now King Charles, when he came to Hillsborough after the death of his mother. In 1986, at its Ordesh, Sinn Féin amended its constitution to allow members to take their seats in the Dáil. It caused a row and a walkout by the likes of Rory O'Brothick. It would take, that was 1986, it would take until 1997, 3 years after the IRA ceasefire, before the first Sinn Féin TD in 40 years was elected to Dáil Éireann, Caoimhín O'Quillan of Cavan Monaghan. One morning in 1988, I was having a shower, listening to Morning Ireland, RTE's main early morning current affairs programme. I was listening to it on a transistor radio. I heard a report about the homecoming of the remains of 3 IRA members who were shot dead by the SAS in Gibraltar. Danny McCann, Mairead Farrell, Sean Savage, and Danny McCann. The bodies were flown to Dublin Airport and were then brought by hearse to Belfast. There was a reported 2,000 people at Dublin Airport and more crowds along the route. I remember hearing that package put together by a young reporter called Jenny McGeever. I heard the voice of someone involved in the arrangements. He wasn't named, but immediately I recognized him as Martin McGuinness. I instantly knew there would be trouble because it was a breach of Section 31. The package had been turned around by a tired reporter during the night and aired without somebody of a more senior editorial rank listening to it. Jenny was a freelance. She subsequently left RTE. She has since become a very successful criminal law solicitor and, according to her Twitter account, a European arrest warrant solicitor. I think I saw her featuring recently as the solicitor representing Jonathan Dowdall in a current high-profile trial in the Special Criminal Court. So, what was it like working as a journalist in RTE during those days? Difficult. Difficult. Let me give you an extreme example. Towards the end of the 1980s, there was a huge row over government plans to introduce a ROD licence charge. It met with stiff resistance, particularly in areas of Mayo and Galway, where there's a great tradition of fishing. So what happened if you were interviewing a fishing enthusiast who might be a member of Sinn Féin? Were they out to embarrass the government? Were they out to show up the all-embracing nature of Section 31? Were they entitled to have their views about politics and to separate them from their views about fishing? I was struck during one of the presentations about the timing of the O'Toole decision. 1993, the year before the IRA ceasefire. After, around the time of the Downing Street Declaration. Struck too by how the legislation was no longer renewed after 1994, the time of the IRA ceasefire. I remember that August weekend so well. Section 31 is gone now, and I hope it'll never return. But let me conclude with a few observations and questions. Did the lifting of the broadcasting ban accelerate the end of the IRA and the Republican movement moving to commit itself to exclusively peaceful means? I think it did. What role did the ban of access to radio and television have on the internal debate within the Republican movement? I can't say with any certainty. I knew Martin McGuinness well. I know Gerry Adams well. In all the times I've interviewed them, and in all the chats I've had with him, Gerry Adams in particular, do I think he ever told me the full truth, or might at some stage tell me the full truth about his involvement in the IRA? No. Because if he did, there would be people who would call for him to be arrested and sent to jail. That would happen, inevitable. Do I think that Martin McGuinness ever told me or any other journalist the full truth about his involvement in the IRA? No. He acknowledged he was a member of the IRA up to the mid-70s, but he served a prison conviction, a prison sentence for his conviction in relation to that offence. Martin McGuinness always said his links with the IRA ended then. I didn't believe him. I got on with him better than most journalists, but I always took it that if he told me or anyone else the full extent of his IRA activities, he would go to jail. Do I think McGuinness and Adams had a vital role in the peace process? Absolutely yes. Would it have happened without them? Certainly not at the same pace. And finally, could Section 31 be applied now? No. Through social media, you just couldn't impose that level of control and censorship. It's a jungle out there now, as we all know. But I also believe, even though, and I go back to where my opening remarks and Roger's contribution. Even though we're in this period of flux where the debate about a united Ireland is very real, where our relationship with the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, the British government, is under strain because of Brexit, where there are tensions and insecurities and loyalism. I don't see in our lifetime, I don't see a return to the kind of campaign that we saw during the Troubles, because I don't think, because of the advance of technology, because of the way things can be bugged, because there are cameras in every other street, because of just that level of intelligence gathering and a different form of control that's out there, I don't think it would be possible in the current world to carry out the kind of campaign that paramilitaries carried out for the decades of the Troubles. And the point I'll use to illustrate that is how quickly dissident groups can be infiltrated and brought before the courts and curtailed in recent years. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for the invitation.